In this video, I am going to show you how to use constraints and formulas and expressions to increase the quality of your survey. The problem that I'm trying to address can be illustrated if I preview this survey by clicking on the Preview Survey button. If you notice, in the General section I have a question, number 2, that says enter your age. The problem with this questionnaire is that I can enter into this field any number, let's say 572. And this is clearly not a reasonable answer for an age question. So I need some validations that will make sure that whoever's entering data into this questionnaire does not enter unreasonable data. If I enter a reasonable number into this field, like 30, and I go to my health section, you will see that there's a question, number 4, that says at what age did you start smoking? Now if I enter 50 here, this is a reasonable age, but it's not a reasonable answer because I have stated in the general section that my age is 30. So clearly I cannot have started smoking when I was 50. This number should be less than the number that I've stated in the general section, and possibly less by 10 years. In my education section, I have questions that are asking me how many years it took me to graduate from a university degree, from a master's degree, or a PhD. These are also numbers, and I can enter into any one of these fields any reasonable number, like for example 300,000. And this is clearly not a correct answer. In the Your Work section, I have a question that says how many hours per day do you spend at work? And this number I could enter 80, and this is clearly not a reasonable answer because there are only 24 hours per day. But even if I had stated 10, the system is asking me in question 16 how many hours per day do you spend reading email at work? And I could answer here 12. Now this is clearly an incorrect answer, not because it's not a reasonable answer because it's less than 24, but because I stated in the previous field that I spent 10 hours at work. So obviously the hours I spent reading email, the hours I spent in meetings, and the hours I spent playing games all together should be less than the number of hours that I spent at work. So I need some intelligence in this survey, and I'm going to add that intelligence in this video to show you how to create a survey that when you capture data, it's going to ensure that the data that you captured is of high quality. So the first thing that I'm going to do is to add a constraint to the QAge variable. I do this by going into this little eye icon, clicking it, and selecting the type of constraint. I have two types of constraints: simple constraints and advanced constraints. Simple constraints are things like greater than or equal to, or less than, or between, or equals to, and they're made so that the system makes it easy to specify a very simple condition. Advanced constraints are where I enter an expression and I state what is it that I want in a more programmatic way. I'm going to use a simple constraint that says between, and I'm going to say when the system presents to me the pop-up window that this number should be between, I'm going to say 15 and 100, and I'm going to state that when this constraint fails, a message should appear. And I'm going to add a message that the age must be between 15 and 100. Now there's a menu that is asking me what type of constraint. There's 3 options. We're called flexible, hard, and weak. Hard constraints are those constraints where the system will tell you that if the answer is outside these parameters, it's plain wrong, and it will not let you submit the questionnaire. I'm going to test this first to show you how this works by saving the constraint and going to preview my survey. You will notice that underneath the age variable I now have the specification, and the system translated the simple constraint between to a formula. And those that are familiar with Excel will recognize this formula fairly easily. If I preview my survey, I will see that to the right of my field now there's a little eye icon. If I put my cursor on top of that eye icon, the system will tell me what the constraint is, and if I type 14, it's going to tell me that the age must be between 15 and 100. If I type 105, it's going to give me the same message, and if I type 85, it's going to accept the answer. Now, I am going to edit this particular constraint by clicking on the Edit Constraint button, and I am going to change the constraint from hard to flexible, and I'm going to save my constraint. If I preview my survey, I will see that question 2 has the same constraint, and if I enter, let's say 105, the system is going to give me the error that I was expecting, but it's going to allow me to accept this value if I enter a justification, i.e. I can say, I'm going to add the justification that says in the Guinness World Records as the oldest man, because it's 105, and I can add the justification. Once I add the justification, the system will allow me to save the questionnaire, but it'll show the justification to anybody that is looking at the questionnaire. A flexible constraint is used when you have a question that you have an expected range, but you're allowing your users to go outside that expected range if they justify it and explain why it is that this answer is exceptional. So that it's not really limiting you, but it's enabling you to enter unreasonable data, but you have to justify it. If I go back to my edit and I edit my constraint again, and I change my constraint type from flexible to weak, and I save it, you will notice that during the survey data entry, if I enter 105, the system will give me a warning that is in orange underneath the field, and it will just warn me that the value should be between 15 and 100, but it will allow the user to save it. So hard constraints give you an error, and that error prevents saving. Flexible constraints are those that give you an error but allow the users to justify the answer and continue, and weak constraints are those where the system will provide you a warning, but it will allow you to continue. I'm going to show you now how to use a constraint using a formula. Please note that in the general section I have my variable that's called QAge. I'm going to make reference to this particular variable because I'm going to go to my Your Health section, and I will notice that I have the question called QH smoke. So to this particular question I'm going to add a constraint, but I'm going to add an advanced constraint, and I'm going to add an expression. In the expression field, I'm going to type the name of the variable that I have here, which is called QH smoke, and I'm going to say that this variable should be less than QH, and I'm going to say that this number should be less than the age stated in general information section. If I save my constraint and I preview my survey, I can test this by entering an age of 30 and then going to my health and entering an age of 31. In this case, it's going to tell me that this number should be less than the age stated in the general information section, and I can change it to 29, and the system is going to let me go through. So it is that easy to create an advanced constraint where I can put a formula that is any expression, any formula I can type in that relates any variable in the survey. I'm going to show you next how to use an advanced constraint. For this, I'm going to go to the Your Work section, and I will notice that I have here several variables, and I'm going to have two expressions that I'm going to add. One of them is an expression that will guarantee that the hours worked are within acceptable range, and for that I'm going to add a simple constraint that says that the expected values fall between 0 and 12 hours with a fail message, and I'm going to make this constraint flexible so that it is possible to enter an 18 or 20 hour work day if for some reason the user is actually working that much. I'm going to save my constraint, and I'm going to add another constraint. Now the next constraint I'm going to add is on the hours that I spent per day reading email at work. This should definitely be a combination of two rules. The first rule will be a advanced constraint, and I'm going to make that expression such that the hours that I spent reading email cannot be greater than or equal to the hours that I spent working. And I'm going to have my message, and I'm going to save my constraint. The next constraint that I'm going to add is on the same variable, but I'm going to make sure that the sum of all three activities, reading email, having meetings, and playing, do not exceed the number of hours at the workplace. So I'm going to do this by basically adding a new constraint, and I'm going to save my constraint. I am going to replicate this particular constraint on all three fields, basically because the constraints are fired when a field is modified. So if I want to check that this is correct, I have to check on all three variables, and I'm going to basically duplicate the constraint on all three variables that are affected. So I'm going to come and I'm going to add the expression here, and I am going to add the expression here. This way, when the constraint is fired, it'll actually be checked on all three places. If I preview my survey and I go to the Your Work section and I scroll down, I can see how this plays out. So this constraint basically says that I have to be between 0 and 12. So if I say 15, it's going to fire a constraint, and I'm going to say 8, and I'm going to add again. If I say 9, it's going to fire the constraint that says that I cannot spend all my time reading email because it's greater than 8. But if I say 3, it's not going to fire a constraint, and if I say here 3, it's not going to fire a constraint. But if I say 3 and now the sum of all these three variables is 9, it's going to tell me that the numbers of hours I spent reading email has to fit in my workday. Again, if I come and I change this to 5, it's going to tell me the same thing on all the places places where the constraint has been checked. So if I change this to 2 and I change this to 2 and I change this to 2, my constraints will actually fit within my workday, and my survey will be saved. So I'm going to do one other thing on this particular questionnaire, and is to add a computed value that shows me how many hours of actual productive time I have. And I'm going to do this by editing my survey and adding in this particular page from this toolbar a computed value. A computed value is just like a variable, and it has a unique identifier, and I'm going to call it productive work with a label that reads, and I'm going to make this expression the hours worked minus all the time that I spent doing email, meetings, and playing, and I'm going to consider that my productive time. And I'm going to save my question, and when I preview my survey, I will see that in the work section I have now on the bottom what's called a computed variable, which is basically a variable or a question that is computed automatically. And I'm going to add, for example, here 8, and I'm going to say that I spent 1 hour reading email, that I spent 2 hours in meetings, and I spent 3 hours playing games. That basically means that I have 2 hours that are actual productive work in the office. So what I demonstrated in this video is the use of formulas and constraints to ensure that your survey has high quality and that the answers that are added into your questionnaire are reasonable, and computed variables that allow you to compute expressions, arithmetic expressions, based on the values of your variables to automatically calculate values rather than asking the users to enter them.